15-minute or less lecture series, Anatomy Physiology, Chapter 9, Nervous System, Part 2. Nerves. Nerves are bundles of axons bounded up by connective tissue found in the peripheral nervous system. So you start with the axon that is myelinated usually highly myelinated. This is called a nerve fiber. This nerve fiber is wrapped around by the endoneurium, a thin layer of connective tissue. Then all these nerve fibers get bundled up together in what's called a fascicle. And the fascicle is surrounded by the perineurium, a sheet of connective tissue called the perineurium. And then all of these fascicles get bundled up with blood vessels into a nerve and are wrapped around by a sheet of connective tissue called the epineurium. Types of nerves. Sensory nerves, which means they only carry information to the sensory nervous system, only have sensory neurons. Motor nerves, they only carry impulses from the central nervous system to effectors, so they're made of motor neurons. And mixed nerves, which carry both sensory and motor fibers. This is actually the most common type. Again, a reflex arc means that you have a receptor that's detecting some sensation that goes to the sensory neuron and carries it to the central nervous system. However, it bypasses the brain and ends up connecting directly to the motor neurons that lead to an effect by the muscle or gland. So these are automatic responses. They happen without needing a lot of information in response from the brain. So examples of this: vomiting, sneezing, swallowing, kicking. So for instance, we have the patellar reflex. The doctor hits the patellar ligament with the hammer. This stretches the patellar ligament, leading to the receptor, a sensory neuron, to carry the information to the spinal cord. It'll then synapse with an axon of a motor neuron that will go straight to the muscles that are relevant for causing a kick in response. So again, two neurons, one effector bypasses the brain, although of course the brain knows that we did the kick, it just didn't have any control over whether it happened or not. Withdrawal reflex is similar. In this case, let's say we step on some sharp attack, our sensory neuron detects this, carries sensory information to the spinal cord, then synapses with an interneuron, which synapses with an axon of a motor neuron, which carries the command to the muscle to cause us to pull away from the source of pain. This is another reflex. Doesn't need the brain per se, but of course, we're going to know about it. Meninges. Meninges are sheets of connective tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord. They lie between the bone and the soft tissues. The superficial layer of the meninges is the dura mater. The dura mater is tough, white, dense connective tissue, also has blood vessels running along it. When we're talking about the vertebral canal, we also have the epidural space, the space on the outside of the dura mater, between the dura mater and the bone. Then we have, deep to that, the arachnoid mater, thinner layer of connective tissue. After the arachnoid mater comes a space referred to as the subarachnoid space. This space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then the deepest meninx lying on the brain or spinal cord is the pia mater. So we have the vertebrae, the epidural space, dura mater, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space filled with cerebral spinal fluid, pia mater, and the spinal cord. Spinal cord starts at the foramen magnum and travels all the way down to about between the first and second lumbar vertebrae, so it does not go fully all the way down the vertebral canal. The spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off its 31 segments. So what we see here is the sensory side, where we have the dorsal root ganglion leading to the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, which then, of course, is attaching to the posterior side of the spinal cord. And from the anterior side, we have the ventral root of the spinal cord, which is all motor control going out. So the spinal cord is formed from the dorsal root sensory and the ventral root motor, making all spinal nerves mixed nerves. Spinal cord has two enlargements at the cervical area, the cervical enlargement, which gives rise to the nerves of the upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement that gives rise to the nerves of the lower limbs. As you can see on this transverse section of a spinal cord, we have gray matter shown as sort of a butterfly and white matter around that. There is this posterior median sulcus versus the much larger anterior median fissure, and then in the middle of the gray matter is this opening called the central canal filled with cerebrospinal fluid. You can name various regions of the white matter with the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus, right and left, of course. And then the gray matter has its name structures. You have this connection between the right and left sides of the gray matter called the gray commissure. Then you have the posterior horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn. Function of the spinal cord houses spinal reflexes, such as the patellar reflex we talked about, transmits impulses to and from the brain. Ascending tracts carry sensory information to the brain. Descending tracts carry information from the brain. A tract is a collection of axons grouped together in the central nervous system. The brain, boom, 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 largest, most complex portion of the central nervous system, has over 100 billion interneurons, which are multipolar neurons. In the brain, the gray matter is on the outside in the cerebral cortex, and the white matter is on the inside, although there are some nuclei within the white matter. The brain is broken down in 4 portions. We have the largest portion, the cerebrum. Then we have the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. As you can see here, something looks kind of like a seahorse. So the diencephalon is the head of the seahorse. The brainstem is the neck, belly, and tail of the seahorse. So the cerebrum, largest portion, broken down into 2 hemispheres, or right and left hemisphere, separated by a longitudinal fissure. You can see all these coiled structures on the surface of the cerebrum. The hills, the things that stick up, are the gyrus. The depressions or valleys is the sulcus. So gyrus, sulcus. Also see this white structure here. This is the corpus callosum that connects the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is where we house our sensory functions, motor functions, and higher mental functions. Again, cerebral cortex, gray matter on the outside, has many, many, many neural cell bodies and lots of synapsing. You can break each hemisphere of the cerebrum into 5 lobes. You have the frontal lobe under the frontal bone, the parietal lobe under the parietal bone, the occipital lobe near the occipital bone, the temporal lobe under the temporal bone. And then if you go into this lateral sulcus and cut away some tissue, you can find the insula. So the 5th lobe is the insula. The cortex can be divided into motor, sensory, and associated areas. Here again is the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus, which is between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Cutaneous sensations go to the primary somatosensory area found here, the very beginning, the frontal anterior part of the parietal lobe. All sensations involving the skin and the muscles. If you look at this gyrus, the strip of the gray cerebral cortex, you see that the body is mapped out with different regions of the body corresponding to different areas. And in areas that have more sensations, more sensory neurons coming from it, end up having a larger portion of this somatosensory area. Then we have taste sensation localized to the insula, visual sensations localized to the occipital lobe, auditory sensations in the temporal lobe. Then we have associated areas that help work with that sensory information, try to process it, use it. So in the front, we have associated areas for concentration, planning, problem solving, thinking. Temporal lobe has associated areas for interpreting auditory patterns, so we actually recognize what we're hearing. Occipital lobe has some associated areas for processing visual information, so we actually recognize what the object is. There's a sensory speech area for helping us to actually understand the words. Then there are motor areas. Their primary motor area is the posterior gyrus of the frontal lobe, right next to the central sulcus, and this will send out the commands for all our voluntary muscle movements. It also has its own homunculus, a map out of our bodies based on how many muscles are found in those areas. So the hand, the face, the tongue, lots of muscles there, so they get a larger region on the primary motor area. You also have some associated areas for motor control, the frontal eye field for moving the eyes, controlling the movement of the eyes, a motor speech area for actually forming the words, so we're able to say words and speak. There is some idea that there is it turns out that the right side of the brain, the right hemisphere, is actually receiving and controlling the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere is controlling the right side of the body. This is because the tracks going to the 2 sides of the brain cross over in the brain stem. If you look within the white matter, you can see some gray areas. These are the basal nuclei. They are deep masses of gray matter with lots of cell bodies of neurons that relay motor impulses from the cerebrum and help control motor activities. So, for instance, they interact and signals back and forth to the motor cortex, thalamus, the cerebellum to alter movement and control motor activities. We know that damage to these areas can lead to Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. There are ventricles. Ventricles are spaces in the brain that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. They have choroid plexuses, which are epidermal cells next to capillaries that produce the cerebral spinal fluid from the bloodstream, and then the cerebral spinal fluid will leave the ventricles, the right and left lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and fourth ventricle, and go down the central canal of the spinal cord, wrap around the spinal cord and the brain in the subarachnoid spaces. Cerebral spinal fluid is important. It helps to support and buoy the brain and spinal cord in place, helps to absorb forces, cushions the brain and spinal cord to try to prevent injury, and also is a source of ions for the nervous tissue. Diencephalon, the head of the seahorse. Diencephalon has two main regions, the thalamus, which is the main head area, and the hypothalamus, the mouth of the seahorse. They also have some associated structures, the optic chiasm, where the optic nerves cross over a mammillary body on the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, which is important, the infundibulum, which is a structure that attaches to the pituitary gland. So it looks like the hypothalamus is attached to the pituitary gland. The thalamus is important in sorting and directing sensory information. Almost all sensory information is relayed through the thalamus. It pinpoints where the information is coming from, gives us a general awareness of that sensation, and then can communicate with other parts of the brain and receive information from the motor fibers from the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, mouth of the seahorse, has lots and lots of functions associated with homeostasis. It regulates various visceral activities, links to the endocrine system and nervous system, regulates heartbeat and arterial pressure, regulates body temperature, water and electrolyte balance in the blood, hunger, thirst, overall body weight, controls movements and secretions of the digestive tract, helps regulate sleep and wakefulness and our circadian rhythm of sleeping and waking. There's also the limbic system, which is structures lying on the border between the diencephalon and the cerebrum. They are normally associated with emotions, also with memory, and a little bit of olfaction, since our olfaction bulb is considered part of it. So smell, memory, and emotions. In general, give us an idea of what's pleasant and what's not unpleasant so that we can adjust for survival reasons. And that's it for this